Okay, so let's get started. The first thing I'll do is I'll go to github.com/treehouse/settings dash panel. And this is the repository that is associated with this project. Let's zoom in a little bit. So in here, we will have our primary color, which is that orange. And then we will have these light themed CSS variables, and we'll override them with a dark theme, which are also in the README. And then our data file is also in here. And I'll show you how to use all this whenever we get to that point. First things first is let's just clone down this project. So I'll hit the big green code button, and then I'll hit this copy to clipboard button. You can use GitHub Desktop if you'd like. I'm going to use my terminal. So I will change directories to desktop. And then I'll write git clone and then paste in that link. And then I will drag that project to VS Code. So at any point, if you get stuck or when you're finished, if it's just not looking the way mine is, you can find all the finished code in this master folder right here. But we will be working in this starter folder. So let's go over what we have in here so far. In our HTML file, it is just a standard HTML boilerplate code. We do have a settings panel for our title, and we have our CSS style sheet linked up. We will be using SCSS for this project. We won't be doing anything complex with it. We'll just be using it for nesting. So inside of our styles folder, we have an app.scss file, which we will write all of our styles for, and it will automatically be compiled to CSS for us with the Sass compiler extension. If you don't have that, all you need to do is click on extensions and type in Sass, and then you'll find this live Sass compiler extension. All you need to do is click on that and click install, and you should be good to go. Once you are working inside of this starter folder right here, you just need to click this watch Sass button and it'll compile everything for you and you'll be able to follow along with me. In this folder, we also have our scripts file, which is an app.js file, and it's empty. And then our images folder. And in here, we have our mockup. So this is what we'll be building out. And then we have our Treehouse logo, which will be this logo down here. So let's go over the mockup a little bit. We have a settings panel with 3 separate settings. Each of them have a title, a description, and a toggle switch. And none of these will actually do anything except this last one, the dark mode. We will actually make this toggle a dark theme for our settings panel. So let's get started with the markup. I will open up the mockup on the right just so that we can start building out our UI a little bit. So I will put everything inside of a settings panel container. I'll just call this, I'll create a div with the class of settings panel. And that'll be this big white settings panel that we have here. In here, I want to have just 2 children. Our header that has our h1 for settings, and then our settings container, which will hold all of our settings. So let's create that now. I'll write header, and inside of that, I'll give it an h1 and write settings. And then underneath that, I'll write a div with the class of settings. And we'll need to use this with JavaScript later on. So I'll give this an ID as well of settings. And also our entire UI is going to be inside of this settings panel div that we created that we'll also need to use with JavaScript later. So I'll go ahead and give that an ID also. And I'll just call it settings panel. Sweet. So I'll hit save. And now let's start creating each individual setting. So each one of these will look exactly the same, just have different content. So I'll do a div with the class of setting. And the only things that I want in this container are the label and the checkbox. So this label will have a title and a description, and then our checkbox will write some styles to style it like a toggle switch. So let's give our setting container a label element, and we'll leave the for attribute empty for now. And in here, we'll have a span that we'll use for our title. And I'll copy that again so that we have another span for our description. Outside of our label, we can write an input with the type of checkbox. We can go ahead and delete the name attribute because we won't need that. And that is it for our individual setting markup. So let's copy that a few times. And I'll put some comments on top to know which one is which. So this one will be for auto saving photos. The second one will be for location services. And the last one will be for our dark mode theme. So now let's start adding in the content that we'll need in here. You can go back to our GitHub and read the README file for this, or you can just go directly into the README file. I'll open this up on the side. And if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see a bunch of objects. And these objects have all of our data in them. We'll use this in the JavaScript later, but for now, we can just copy what we need from this. So inside of our label, we have this for attribute. And we also have an ID attribute on our input. These need to be the same so that when we click on our label, it'll also toggle this checkbox. So this is where the UID comes in, which is over here on the right. So it stands for unique ID. And I'll copy the first one for autosave photos, and I'll use it as our for attribute on our label, and then our ID for our input. And then for the title, I'll copy this and paste it in our first span. And then our description, I'll copy and paste into our second span. And now I will repeat this for the other settings as well. So let's grab our title for location services. And then our description. And now our unique ID. Let's copy, and I'll also paste that as the ID for our checkbox input. And now the last one, which is for dark mode. So let's copy the title, paste it in the first span, copy the description, paste it in the second span. And lastly, we'll do our unique ID of dark mode. And that will be for our for attribute for our label, as well as the input type checkbox. We'll use the ID and hit save. So I'm using Live Server to view this live. So down here, I can just go ahead and click Go Live, and it should spin up a browser. So this is what it looks like so far. It's very unstyled, but this is all we need. And checking that we can click on our label to toggle the checkbox, and it works. So that's great. I'll go ahead and push this to the side of my screen, and then I'll use the other side for the code, and now we can begin styling. So let's go ahead and open up our style sheet. Everything will be inside of the app.scss file. So first things first, let's go back to our GitHub, or you can do the README, it doesn't matter. And let's grab these variables. So by default, our UI will have this first set of variables for our light theme. So let's go ahead and set up a rule for our settings panel and paste those in there. Oops, backspace that. And now let's do the same thing, but for settings panel when it has the class of dark. And what we can do is paste in the second set of variables. This second set of variables is the exact same as the ones that we just pasted, but they're different colors. So they have all the same names, just different colors, which means when our settings panel gets a class of dark, these colors will override these colors. And we'll go into detail more about that whenever we get to that point. But all we're doing right now is initializing these variables. We'll need to add them to our UI, and we can get started with that now. So our main UI is going to have a big orange background. So we'll use this primary BG CSS variable. And to use a CSS variable, if you're not familiar with it, is pretty simple. For our body, we'll just write background color. And to use that primary BG CSS variable, we just write var with a set of parentheses and then the CSS variable name. So if I hit save, we should see the changes in the browser. So I do need to run my Sass compiler. So as mentioned earlier, if you're joining late, this is just an extension called Live Sass Compiler. Just install this, and then you'll have this Swatch Sass button at the bottom. When you click that, it'll automatically convert your Sass code to CSS. I'll go ahead and move this to the bottom so that we can still see what we're doing. So we set the background color for our body to the primary BG CSS variable, which is this orange color. Next, let's go ahead and add in our background image. So we'll write background image and we'll do URL, and then we'll navigate to images and then our treehouse logo.png. Sweet, it worked, but now we see it all over the place. And in the mockup, it shows that it's kind of just in the bottom left corner. So let's adjust that. We can do background repeat, and we'll do no repeat. I personally don't like to use the shorthand property for backgrounds, so I'll put everything on its own line. We'll set the background repeat to no repeat. We'll do background position, bottom left, and we'll hit save. And it's still all the way at the top, and this is because the body is only as high as the content that we have set. So we can do a height of 100 view height, and now it's at the bottom left. But it's a little big, so let's do background size, and we could do 250 pixels. There we go. It's a little bit better. It's a little smaller. So the only item that we have in our body is this div with the class of settings panel. So I want to center this in the middle of our page. So the easiest way to do that would be to use flex. So we can set the body's display to flex. We'll justify the content to center, and we'll align the items as to center as well. And there we go. Now we have our content centered, which is perfect. So with that out of the way, let's start styling our only child of the body, which is the settings panel. So we can write settings panel. And the first thing I want to do is give it a background color. And we have a background color in our CSS variables, which is panel BG. So I'll go here, click copy, and I will set it up by writing var and then the variable name. And now you can see that we have our white background. I'll give it a bit of padding. I'll do padding to rim, and I will give it a width of 80%, which looks great when the window's this size, but if we made our app full screen, it would stretch. So let's give it a max width as well. We can set our max width to 550 pixels. Let's see how that looks. I think that looks pretty good. All right, now let's add some border radius. We can do border radius 1 rim. And let's give it some box shadow. We can do 0, 12 pixels, 12 pixels, RGBA, and we'll do black and make it pretty opaque. Sweet, I think that looks pretty good. So now let's start by targeting the header. And I am nesting this with SCSS. In our header, we have just our H1. So we can do color, and we do have a heading color right here. So I'll copy that variable name, and I'll write var, and I'll paste that in. I need to add the opening parentheses. Sweet, and it made our settings H1 just a little bit lighter in color. I'll give it a margin bottom of toRim to give us some spacing. And that is pretty much going to be it for our header. So now we have our other child of our settings panel, which is the settings container. There's really nothing that we'll do in here. So let's just start styling setting, which is each individual setting inside of our panel. So in here, what we can write is, first off, let's give them a margin of 1 rem and auto for the left and right. That's not a lot. Let's maybe do 2 rem. There we go. That looks pretty good. So we also have a color set up for our info, and that is called settings info color, which is a lighter gray. So I'll copy that and I'll paste that inside of our setting rule. And there we go. Now, one thing that you'll notice in the mockup is that, well, two things that you'll notice about the label is that our title is bold and our description is not as bold. And they're also each on their own line. So let's see if we can tackle that first. So let's target the span, or I should say the label. And then we'll target the span inside of the label. And what we'll do here is we'll set each span's display to block to put them each on their own line. That worked out perfectly. So now let's target the last child or last of type for the span and set the font weight to 300. Sweet. Now the only other thing that we'll need to do is make sure our toggle switch or our checkbox is all the way to the right. And because our label has, actually, because our setting has only 2 children, which is the label and the checkbox, this will be perfect for flex. So let's give our setting a display of flex. We'll justify the content, space between, and just to make sure it stays centered, we'll align items center. Awesome. Now our checkbox is all the way to the right. But let's give it a little bit of space by setting our labels width to 80%. There we go. I think that looks pretty good. So now the only thing that we have left to do for our UI is to turn our checkboxes into toggle switches, which is pretty simple, and we can do that with just CSS. So let's target our input that's inside of our setting container, and we'll give it an appearance of none. And just to make sure it's compatible with all browsers, we'll do WebKit appearance none as well. And this should erase it from the UI, or set its appearance to none, I'm sorry. So now what we can do is we can give it a width of, let's say 50 pixels and a height of 25 pixels. And we'll give it a border radius of 25 pixels for that pill shape. And we can't see anything yet because it doesn't have a background color. So let's go ahead and add background color. And what we'll do is we'll grab checkbox background unchecked variable. We'll paste that in, hit save, and now we should see the background of our toggle switches. Now we'll want to have an actual switch on the inside of this, and the easiest way to do that is by using the after pseudo element on our input. So let's go ahead and do that now. We can write after, and we'll want to position this absolutely. So its parent, which is the input, needs to be positioned relative. So we'll write position relative on the input itself, and then back into our after pseudo element, we can do position absolute, and we'll do a top of 50%, a left of 50%, and transform translate negative 50% on both the X and Y axis. Now we won't see anything yet, so what we need to do is give it a height, a width, and then a background color. So let's do height of 23 pixels and a width of 23 pixels and a background color of course, we have this one set up in a variable too. So this is our switch color. So we'll copy this variable name and we'll paste it back into our variable. And we're still not seeing anything on here. So why is that? Okay, so our after pseudo element needs content. So we'll set it to just 2 quotes, and there we go. Now we see it. So let's give it a border radius of 50 pixels. I'm sorry, 50%, so that we get that nice circular shape. And let's actually make it 22 pixels in height and width, or maybe even 21. I think 21 looks good. We'll adjust the left property to 30% to push it all the way to the left. Maybe we'll do the height 20 and width 20 as well. There we go. This looks a little bit better. And now we have our toggle switches. They don't actually do anything yet because we need to adjust the way this looks when the checkbox is in a checked state, which is pretty easy to do. So let's close our code block for our after pseudo element, and let's write our checked pseudo class. So basically, what do we want this to look like when our element is checked or has that checked pseudo class? Well, we'll want to update the background color. And we have a variable for that too, which is checkbox BG when it's checked. So I'll paste that in. And the next thing we'll want to do is target the switch on the inside, because when this is checked, we want this to be on the right side. So we can write after to target our after pseudo element, and we'll change the left to 70%. There we go. So our second item is checked, and now it's unchecked, and you see that our checkbox appears like a actual toggle switch. But let's give this some transitions so that it can animate pretty smoothly. And the way that we can do that is by giving a transition of background color on the input element itself of 0.3 seconds ease. And then we'll want to also transition the left property on our after pseudo element. So we'll do 0.3 seconds ease for that as well. And now when we click, we have a nice subtle animation whenever we click our checkbox. Sweet. Only thing I'm not liking is the width of our input. So let's maybe put this to 45 pixels. There we go. This looks a little bit nicer. I like that. So that's it. Our UI is complete. And we were able to do this with just HTML. So what I want to do now is render these settings in the JavaScript dynamically, which is actually pretty simple to do. So the first thing I'll do is I'll go back to our GitHub, and I'm going to copy our list of objects that holds all this data. And in our text editor, I'm going to go to our scripts and open up app.js. And I will create an array. I'll call this const settings data, and I'll equal it and I'll set it equal to an empty array. And then inside this array, I will paste our list of objects. So now we have an array of objects. Now that we have this, let's go ahead and comment out our individual settings so that there's nothing in our UI. Awesome. So now our UI looks pretty empty. Let's see if we can dynamically render this content. So because this is an array, what we can do is loop over this and do something with each item in the array. And the best way to do that is by using the for each method. So we'll write our settings array name, which is the settings data. We'll do settings data.forEach. And for each setting in the array, what do we want to do? Well, we want to create the setting UI. So this sounds like a really good job for a function. So let's write create setting as a function, and as a parameter, we'll use each setting that's being processed through the loop. So let's go ahead and create this function. Down below, you can write function create setting, and we want to use data as an argument. And what we want to do is basically render the HTML that we made earlier. So let's come in here and copy this. And we can paste that. Well, let's not paste it in here yet. Let's see. We want to create this markup inside of this container. So this settings ID will need this. So let's do const settings equals document.getElementById settings. And we'll want to do settings.inner HTML equals, and we'll do backticks so that we can interpolate some data. So now let's paste in that markup, and let's fix the indentation a little bit. There we go. So what we'll want to do is interpolate this for attribute for our label, the ID for the checkbox, the title, and the description. So each time this settings data.forEach runs, it will give us the current item being processed. So setting, the first time this goes through the loop, this setting variable right here will equal this first item, which is our first object being processed. And in our function, we're using the data argument to represent that. So what we can do is interpolate these values. And we can do that by writing a $sign and then 2 opening and closing curly braces. So let's go ahead and do that. And now what we can do is we can take whatever data we're getting passed into this function when we're calling it and do data.uid, because UID will be our unique ID that we're using. And then for the title, we'll do data.title, because we have a title property. And then we also have a description property. So let's copy that. We can do data.description. And then also we'll need that UID again for our ID for our checkbox. Sweet. And there we go. I hit save, and now we still have our settings panel. And this time the data is being rendered dynamically. So that is it for rendering the data dynamically with JavaScript. So our markup, we can delete all of this. And I like to put in a comment that says dynamic rendered, dynamically rendered. Okay, so let's hit save. And now let's see if we can't get this dark mode toggle to work. So what we'll want to do is when this is checked, this is still a checkbox. So we have access to the change event handler, event listener on this. So we'll want to listen for that. And when this is checked, we want to add a class of dark to our settings panel, which is this big white settings panel. It holds everything in there. So let's see how we can do that. Let's write an if statement to see if dark mode exists. We have this set up as an ID. So if we inspect the page, let's make this a little bit bigger so that we can see. If I click on this checkbox right here, it has an ID of dark mode, which you can see right there. And what we want to do is, if the page has that, we want to set an event listener on it. So if, let's do document.getElementById dark mode. And we'll need that again, so let's just copy this. So if this exists, we want to add an event listener to it. And this would be a change event because this is a checkbox. So when we detect a change, we want to see if it's checked or not. So we can do that by using the event parameter. So if event.target dot checked, we want to add the class of dark. So basically we're saying if this checkbox here is checked, if it's in a checked state, we want to add the dark class to our settings panel. So we should probably set up a variable for our settings panel. We'll do const settings panel equals document.getElement by ID. And if you remember, we set this up with settings panel earlier. Let's take a look in the markup. So our div that holds the entire UI is in this ID settings panel. So now that we have this set up in an ID, a variable that we can use, we'll do settings panel dot class list dot add dark. And if it's not checked, we can write else settings panel dot class list dot remove dark. So let's hit save and see if this worked. Sweet. We now have our variables overriding. And this is happening because if we come up to our style sheet, the settings panel, when it has a class of dark, will have these variables versus these. And these are the variables that we're using to build out and style our UI. So the only other thing that I'd like to do is make the transition for these a little bit better. So let's go and take a look at the settings panel. It has a background color, so we'll want to transition that as well. So we can do transition background color, and we'll do 0.3 seconds ease. And I'll copy this 0.3 seconds ease because we'll use this a ton. Our header has a color, so we'll want to transition that. We'll do transition color 0.3 seconds ease. Each setting has a color as well, so we'll transition that. We'll do transition color 0.3 seconds ease. Let's see what else. That might be it. Let's hit save. Actually, I want to say our after pseudo element has a background color as well, so we can add that. So one way to add multiple transitions is to just separate it by a comma. So we can do background color 0.3 seconds ease. So I'll hit save, and now let's check out our UI. Sweet, it all has a very subtle change from its light theme to its dark theme. Let's make this a little bit bigger. Sweet, this looks really, really good. And this didn't take a whole lot of code. We did a lot of it through just CSS. And that about covers it for building out this awesome interactive settings panel with just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript.